right, stay right there. Do not move toward the vehicle.
I don't consent to any search of my vehicle.
What's all this paperwork? What are you hiding?
Those are my work documents. Please stop throwing my property on the road.
Kruger, stop where you are. Face me.
Sergeant, what's this about?
You are being detained pending investigation. Do not reach for anything.
I didn't do anything. This is a misunderstanding.
Turn around. Hands behind your back.
Officer Mason Kruger had Darnell Brooks standing on the shoulder with his hands visible, while the silver Mercedes sat gutted like a storage unit that got raided. Papers were spread across the pavement. A wallet case, a set of gym earbuds, and a folder of work documents were all out in the open. Kruger kept moving fast, talking louder than he needed to, narrating the mess like he was trying to convince the night that he'd found a criminal. What Kruger didn't understand was that Darnell wasn't panicking because he wasn't hiding anything. He was calm because he'd seen this kind of stop before, and he knew the real danger wasn't a ticket. The danger was an officer deciding the outcome first and working backward. And at this moment, we want to tell you this. We're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. So tell us where you're watching from, what city or state. And if you watch stories where dignity, receipts, and accountability win, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's rewind, because this didn't start with a search. It started with a look. Earlier that evening, Darnell Brooks had been driving home in his silver Mercedes, steady pace, no music blasting, no erratic moves. He looked like what he was, a working professional heading back after a long day, focused and quiet. Nothing about his driving screamed trouble. Officer Mason Kruger still pulled him over. Kruger used one of those vague reasons that left room for anything later. He claimed a minor traffic issue and treated it like a big deal from the first step out of his patrol car. He didn't walk up like a person doing a routine stop. He walked up like he'd already decided what kind of man Darnell was. Kruger's first questions weren't about the reason for the stop. He focused on the vehicle, the price of it, and the idea that Darnell didn't match it. He kept circling the same point in different ways, pushing for a slip-up, pushing for a story, pushing for an opening. Darnell gave him nothing. He stayed polite. He kept his tone even. He handed over the documents he was supposed to. He didn't argue about the stop right there because he understood the dynamic. On the roadside, the officer controlled the pace. Darnell controlled his own discipline. That's when Kruger shifted tactics. Kruger started describing Darnell as suspicious without anything concrete. He said Darnell looked nervous. He claimed Darnell was moving too much. He talked about officer safety while doing things that had nothing to do with safety. He asked where Darnell was coming from, where he was going, why he was in that area, and why he was driving that SUV. It was interrogation disguised as small talk. Darnell answered what he had to and stayed quiet where he could. He didn't volunteer extra details. He didn't try to win Kruger over. He kept his hands visible and his posture controlled, the way trained people do when they're dealing with someone looking for a reason. Kruger then told Darnell to step out of the vehicle. Darnell complied, slowly and clearly, because he knew sudden moves get rewritten later. Kruger positioned him in a way that made the scene look more dangerous than it was, like he wanted a certain picture if anyone drove by. Then Kruger went hands-on. He patted Darnell down. Not a quick check. Not a professional sweep and done. Kruger made it a performance. He moved with extra pressure, acting like he expected to find something. Darnell didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He didn't give Kruger the reaction Kruger seemed to want. When the pat-down produced nothing, Kruger did what officers aren't supposed to do unless they have a lawful reason. He moved straight into the SUV. He didn't ask and wait for consent. He didn't present a clear reason that matched what the camera would later show. He just started searching, and he searched like someone trying to create a scene, not like someone checking a specific concern. He opened compartments. He pulled paperwork from the center console. He dumped items from the glove box. He flipped through a folder like he was hoping something would fall out. He opened the back area and shifted personal items around. He made the interior look like chaos, because chaos makes it easier to claim anything later. Darnell immediately stated clearly that he did not consent to any search. He didn't shout it. He didn't turn it into a speech. He repeated it in a steady voice because he wanted it on the recording. He also asked for the reason Kruger believed he could search. He asked for the legal basis in a way that sounded calm, not challenging, because he understood how quickly challenging gets labeled as aggressive. Kruger brushed him off and kept going. This is where the chess game started. Kruger acted like Darnell's calm was suspicious. He acted like asking questions was suspicious. He used the common routine. Talk fast, move fast, keep the other person off balance, and control the narrative. He kept saying phrases that would sound good later, even if they didn't match what was happening. Darnell countered without escalating. He stayed still. He kept his hands visible. He tracked what Kruger touched, and he said short, factual statements meant for the body cam. That Kruger had opened certain areas, that he had moved certain items, that Darnell had not been asked for consent, and that he had refused consent. He also made it clear he wanted a supervisor on scene. Kruger didn't like that. He snapped back with more authority talk, more implied threats. He suggested Darnell was making things worse for himself. He implied that cooperation meant submission. He tried to pressure Darnell into saying something that could be twisted into probable cause. Darnell did not give him that. The longer the search dragged on, the uglier Kruger's energy got. There was a moment where Kruger stopped searching with any logic and started searching out of frustration. That frustration had a specific source. The SUV wasn't giving him what he wanted. No weapon, no stolen property, no hidden cash, no obvious contraband. Just the normal reality of a working adult's vehicle. Documents, personal items, everyday stuff. But Kruger didn't slow down and reset. He doubled down. He dumped more paperwork onto the ground. He scattered more items. He created a bigger mess, and the mess itself became part of his strategy. If the scene looked like a major discovery was coming, he could justify why he'd gone so far. Darnell watched it all and kept his voice controlled. He repeated that he wanted a supervisor. He repeated that he did not consent. He made sure his body language stayed neutral because he understood something simple. In stops like this, the officer often wants two things: control and a reaction. Darnell refused to give him either. That's when Kruger stepped away from the SUV briefly, like he was thinking. Then he went back in, moving faster again, targeting the same spots he'd already searched, acting like he remembered something he'd conveniently forgotten. His tone changed too, less annoyed, more focused, like he'd decided the stop was not ending without a result. And Darnell noticed the shift right away, because trained people notice when the pattern changes. By this point, Kruger had already called for someone to come out, framing it like he needed support for a suspicious vehicle stop. Darnell knew what that meant. A second officer could either stop the nonsense, or it could turn into a group routine where they validate each other. Either way, the body cam was rolling, traffic was passing, and the scene looked worse by the minute. Kruger's whole posture changed the moment he decided the search wasn't going to fail. He went back into the SUV and started reworking the same areas he'd already torn through, moving with urgency like he was racing a clock. He kept talking louder than before, explaining his actions out loud as if volume could replace facts. Darnell stayed in the same spot on the shoulder, hands visible, body still. He didn't step forward. He didn't try to stop the search physically. He knew exactly how that would be written up later. What he did do was keep marking the timeline in a calm voice for the recording. He noted that Kruger had already searched those spots. He noted that Kruger had removed items and placed them on the ground. He noted again that he had not given consent. Kruger didn't respond to the facts. He responded to the tone. He told Darnell to stop talking, He warned him about obstruction in that familiar way officers use when they want silence, not safety. Then Kruger leaned into the open door, blocked the view with his body for a moment, and straightened up with something small in his gloved hand. A little bag. He held it up like a prize and immediately tried to lock the story in place. He acted like it had been sitting there the whole time, like it had practically introduced itself. Darnell didn't react the way Kruger wanted. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He didn't give a dramatic denial. He looked at the bag, looked at the mess, and then calmly stated that the item had not been there when the vehicle was opened. He repeated that the officer had already searched that area. He repeated that he did not consent. And he asked again for a supervisor. That was the moment Kruger's confidence slipped. Not because he suddenly cared about right and wrong, because Darnell's calm made it hard to sell the caught red-handed story. A panicking suspect makes the officer look heroic. A steady adult narrating the inconsistencies makes the officer look reckless. Kruger tried to reset control by shifting into custody mode. He moved closer to Darnell, told him to turn around, and started reaching for restraints like the decision had already been made. Darnell complied with the positioning but kept his head up. He didn't resist. He didn't stiffen. He didn't do anything that could be twisted into aggression. He kept repeating one key point. The bag was not his, and the search had been non-consensual and chaotic. Kruger then did something that showed he wasn't thinking like a careful officer. He started narrating charges before he had any clean procedure in place. He started treating the stop like a win he could celebrate. That's when Sergeant Elena Ramirez arrived. Sergeant Elena Ramirez pulled up, got out, and immediately took in the scene with the kind of quiet focus that comes from experience. The Mercedes interior was dumped. The ground was scattered with documents and personal items. Kruger was standing too close to Darnell, with the bag held up like a prop. Ramirez didn't match Kruger's energy. She didn't accept his story on arrival just because he wore the uniform. She did what good supervisors do first. She slowed everything down. She separated the conversation. She had Kruger step back and explain, and she had Darnell remain where he was, keeping the scene controlled. Ramirez asked the basic questions that should have already been answered cleanly on body camera. What was the original reason for the stop? What specifically created probable cause when the search began, where the bag was found, and why the vehicle looked like it had been emptied onto the road? Kruger gave answers, but they didn't land right. His explanation leaned on vague claims and gut-feeling language. He kept describing Darnell as nervous and suspicious. He kept framing the SUV itself as suspicious. He kept talking about high crime and officer safety without connecting it to any specific, observable facts. Ramirez looked at the vehicle again. She looked at the spread of items on the ground. Then she looked at Darnell, and she did something that cut straight through the performance. She ran the identification properly, not a quick glance, not a half check. She called it in and waited for confirmation because the stop had already escalated past the point where lazy procedure was acceptable. While she did that, Darnell stayed calm and cooperative. He identified himself in a measured way, including his employment status, without using it like a threat. He didn't demand special treatment. He didn't posture. He simply made it clear that he was a federal law enforcement officer and that the situation was being documented in real time. Kruger tried to talk over that. He minimized it. He acted like it didn't matter. He pushed the idea that contraband was contraband and that he could handle it his way. Ramirez didn't bite. She kept her attention on verification. When dispatch came back, the tone changed fast. Darnell wasn't a random driver with a clean record. He wasn't a lucky stop. He wasn't someone Kruger could bully into a plea. He was an active Deputy United States Marshal, currently assigned, currently credentialed, and very much connected to systems that do not shrug off evidence planting. Ramirez's face didn't turn dramatic. It turned procedural. She didn't announce it to inflate Darnell. She acknowledged it because it changed the entire risk profile of what Kruger had just done. A bad stop was now potentially a federal-level problem. A questionable search was now potentially a criminal act. Ramirez then looked at the bag again and did something that mattered. She stopped treating it like a guaranteed fact. She asked Kruger to walk her through the exact discovery step by step, including where his hands were, what he moved, and why the same area was searched twice. She also asked why the vehicle's contents were dumped like that, because dumped contents create opportunity. Opportunity creates doubt. Doubt destroys prosecutions. Kruger's answers got worse. He became defensive. He tried to rush. He tried to frame Ramirez's questions as undermining him. He tried to push her into backing him automatically. Ramirez didn't back him automatically. She did the opposite. She told Kruger to stop touching anything. She directed him away from the open door. She moved to preserve the scene instead of working the scene. She also requested an additional unit and initiated the chain of notification that supervisors use when something looks like misconduct. Darnell watched all of it without celebrating. He didn't smirk. He didn't antagonize Kruger. He kept his voice even and his hands visible. The only thing he asked for was simple, that his personal items not be handled further, and that the interaction be treated as a serious integrity issue. Ramirez then addressed the biggest problem in front of her. The search itself looked like it had been designed to create a discovery rather than uncover one. The bag didn't appear in a clean, contained way. It appeared after a prolonged, aggressive rummage with the officer, blocking sightlines and revisiting areas already cleared. That detail mattered, and Ramirez knew it. She took possession of the bag in a controlled way, documented it, and prevented Kruger from narrating over the evidence process. Then she made a decision that Kruger wasn't expecting. She removed Kruger from the driver's side completely and put another officer in position to oversee. She treated Darnell as a detained citizen who needed to be handled properly, not as a trophy. And then she started asking the questions that don't get asked, unless a supervisor is already thinking about accountability. Whether Kruger's body camera had been on continuously, whether he had called out probable cause before entering the vehicle, and whether he had any prior contact with his driver. Kruger tried to regain control by insisting the case was simple. Ramirez didn't accept simple. She accepted clean. By the time the next unit arrived, Kruger's story had already started collapsing under its own weight. Not because Darnell argued, because Darnell stayed steady while the system finally did what it was supposed to do: verify, document, and supervise. Once Sergeant Elena Ramirez took control, the roadside stopped being a traffic stop and turned into a scene preservation problem. She separated Officer Mason Kruger from the vehicle and from Darnell. She had another unit stand with Darnell while she handled procedure, because she wasn't going to let Kruger keep shaping the story with movement and noise. Ramirez treated the bag like contested evidence, not a victory. She documented where it was presented, noted the condition of the interior, and made it clear on camera that the vehicle had been heavily disturbed before the bag appeared. She also required Kruger to stop giving a running narrative and answer direct, specific questions. Kruger could not keep his timeline straight. His explanations depended on vague claims and shifting details. He kept falling back on generalized suspicion instead of clear observations. Ramirez didn't argue with him. She simply recorded what he said and what the scene looked like. Then she made the calls that changed everything. She notified the watch commander. She requested internal affairs response. She requested a supervisor-to-supervisor contact report because the detained driver was a federal law enforcement officer. She also ensured that body camera footage was secured under protocol, so it could not be altered, delayed, or conveniently lost. Darnell did not try to win the moment on the shoulder. He stayed calm, stayed cooperative, and stayed factual. He provided his credentials properly. He asked for his property to be handled minimally because his documents and personal items were now scattered across a public roadway. He also stated clearly and repeatedly that the search had been non-consensual, and that the bag appeared after multiple researches of the same areas. That mattered because it framed the situation for oversight in real time, not later, not after somebody had time to coordinate stories. Ramirez also did something else that sealed Kruger's problem. She started checking what the cameras would show instead of trusting what Kruger claimed. Kruger's body camera had been running, so had Ramirez's. Another responding unit's camera was running as well. A passing driver had slowed down earlier and recorded the scene from the traffic lane because the stop looked chaotic and excessive. That outside angle didn't capture everything, but it captured enough of Kruger's movements around the open door to raise serious questions. Within hours, Kruger was removed from duty pending investigation. He was ordered to surrender department equipment and submit to administrative procedure. He tried to act like it was just paperwork and that Ramirez was overreacting, but the department could not brush off an allegation of evidence planting, and they definitely could not brush it off when the target was a deputy United States Marshal and multiple cameras showed inconsistencies. Internal affairs moved fast because this was the kind of case that destroys a department in court. They pulled the full body camera files, the dispatch logs, the computer-aided dispatch notes, and Kruger's report drafts. They compared timestamps. They compared what he said he saw to what the cameras showed. They also looked at Kruger's history for patterns, stops that escalated without clear cause, searches that turned into messes, and arrests that depended heavily on his word. The bag itself became its own problem. Chain of custody was examined from the moment Kruger found it. The lab process documented handling and packaging. Investigators checked for prints and trace transfer. They also compared how Kruger described finding it to what the footage showed about where his hands were and when he blocked the view. The case didn't hinge on one dramatic moment. It hinged on accumulation. Every inconsistency stacked until the story could not stand. Darnell's calm played a role too. He made a detailed statement, not emotional, not personal, not a speech about the system. He described actions in order. He described what was moved and when. He described the escalation. He described how the bag appeared after repeated searching and after the scene had been turned into chaos. That statement matched the footage in the places where it mattered. Once the department realized they could not defend Kruger, the case moved into criminal territory. A local prosecutor filed charges tied to the misconduct, including evidence tampering and filing a false report. Because the conduct involved a deliberate attempt to turn an innocent person into a suspect through fabrication, federal authorities also took interest. The investigation expanded beyond a policy violation into questions of civil rights abuse and obstruction. Kruger was arrested, not on some dramatic public stage. It was procedural, controlled, and humiliating in the way that matters most to someone like him. He lost the uniform first. Then he lost the authority that came with it. Then he had to sit in the same system he used on other people and wait for decisions he could not control. In court, the case was simple because the footage was simple. The prosecution didn't need to overtalk it. They played the timeline. They showed the search turning into disorder. They showed the researching of areas already checked. They showed the bag appearing after Kruger blocked the view and then immediately narrated it as if it had always been there. They highlighted how his written statements conflicted with camera timestamps. They presented Sergeant Elena Ramirez as a witness who arrived without bias for either man and immediately recognized that the scene did not match a clean discovery. Kruger's defense tried the usual angles. They tried to paint it as a misunderstanding. They tried to argue that disorder happens during searches. They tried to imply Darnell's position gave him influence. None of that fixed the core problem. Kruger's story kept changing while the video stayed the same. The jury didn't need to guess motive. They only needed to decide whether the evidence was handled honestly. It wasn't. Kruger was convicted. He was sentenced to prison time. He was permanently separated from law enforcement. He also became the example department's fear. The officer whose career didn't end with quiet resignation, but with a conviction that followed him everywhere. Darnell's outcome wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. He filed the complaints the right way. He cooperated with investigators. He didn't turn it into a public circus. But the truth still traveled. Word spread through the community. Officers who had seen Kruger's behavior before suddenly felt safer speaking up. People who had felt powerless in stops like that saw something rare, an attempt to frame someone collapsing under oversight. The department also had to change, because the lawsuit risk was real and the credibility damage was worse. They tightened search documentation. They increased supervisor response requirements for escalated stops. They flagged patterns of consentless searches that ended with convenient discoveries. They reinforced body camera compliance with actual consequences. And Darnell quietly became the kind of person others asked for advice. Not advice on how to argue with police. Advice on how to stay alive in the moment and still protect your future. Keep calm. Keep hands visible. Use short factual statements. Request oversight. Let the recording do the heavy lifting. That's the lesson here. When someone in power decides you're guilty first, they will try to manufacture the rest. The only thing that beats that is structure, calm behavior, clear documentation, and a system that is forced to look at what really happened. So now you tell us, if you were in Darnell's position, what would you have done differently, if anything? Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to push you into reacting so they could justify what they wanted to do? Drop your story in the comments, share this with someone who needs it, and if you want more stories where accountability actually lands, make sure you like and subscribe.
Morning. I need to see some identification.
What is the reason?
We got a complaint. Just show me your ID and we're done.
What am I suspected of doing?
Stand up and step outside with me.
You have no lawful right to do this.
That doesn't matter. Stand up.
A patrol officer walked into a quiet downtown cafe and decided a black man reading by the window was the problem he needed to solve. He demanded identification right away, with no clear crime, no clear reason, and a body camera already running. The man at the table refused to play along with vague authority. He stayed seated, kept his hands visible, and kept asking the same basic procedural questions. The officer treated those questions like disrespect and started pushing the situation toward force. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now, quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you like stories where calm people use facts, recordings, and the system's own rules to hold power accountable, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This wasn't a viral stunt. It didn't start with shouting. It started with a routine morning and an officer who thought he could create a reason after the fact. The cafe was called Harbor and Stone, a downtown spot where people worked quietly, kept headphones in, and treated the place like a shared office. The staff knew the regulars. The cameras were visible if you paid attention. And the customers were the type who noticed things, but didn't get involved unless they had to. The man at the window was Julian Mercer. He looked like any other customer. Clean clothes, calm posture, book open, coffee on the table. Nobody in that room knew he was a federal judge. He didn't carry himself like someone looking for a confrontation. He carried himself like someone who didn't want one. Around mid-morning, Officer Kyle Stratton walked in on patrol. His body camera was running. He didn't approach the counter. He didn't ask the staff anything. He scanned the room like he was searching for a target, then walked straight to Mercer's table. Stratton told Mercer there had been a complaint about a suspicious person. He told Mercer he needed to see identification. Mercer didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make sudden movements. He kept his hands visible near the table and asked two questions that matter in any stop like this: whether he was being detained and what the lawful reason was for the demand. Stratton didn't answer cleanly. He repeated the request for ID and framed Mercer's questions as refusal. He tried to turn calm procedure into non-cooperation. That was the first move in the power game, labeling basic rights as attitude. Mercer stayed steady. He kept his tone level. He asked again if he was being detained and what crime was being investigated. He didn't give Stratton anything emotional to use. Stratton shifted his explanation. First, it was a suspicious person complaint. Then it became a safety concern. Then it became a general claim about needing to confirm identity for the area. None of it came with a clear, specific reason tied to Mercer's actions in that cafe. Mercer didn't argue the officer's feelings. He just kept it procedural. He asked for the lawful basis. He asked if he was free to leave. He asked if Stratton was ordering him to do something under detention. Stratton started leaning in closer. The space around the table got tight. Customers nearby stopped typing and started watching without making it obvious. That kind of silence spreads fast in a room like that. People act like they're still working, but they're tracking every movement. Stratton then tried a different tactic. He told Mercer to stand up and step outside. He implied things would be easier outside. That's another common move. Pull the person away from witnesses and cameras, away from a setting where the officer's behavior looks unreasonable. Mercer didn't move. He asked again if he was being detained and what lawful reason required him to stand up and leave the cafe. That's when the cafe manager stepped in. Her name was Tessa Rowe. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't scream. She walked over like someone handling a problem at work, because that's what it was to her. An officer disrupting a paying customer in her business. Tessa told Stratton the staff had not called the police. She said Mercer wasn't causing a disturbance. She made it clear Mercer was welcome there, and she pointed out that the cafe had security cameras. Stratton dismissed her. He didn't ask for details. He didn't say he would check with the counter. He acted like her input didn't matter because she wasn't wearing a badge. Mercer stayed calm and let Tessa do her job. He didn't speak over her. He didn't get pulled into a back and forth. Stratton doubled down. He repeated the ID demand and again described Mercer's calm questions as non-cooperation. He told him to stand and come outside. He used the tone that suggests compliance is the only safe option. Mercer kept it strict. He didn't refuse everything. He refused the lack of lawful basis. He made it clear he would comply with lawful orders once the lawful reason was stated. Stratton's posture changed. He moved closer to Mercer's side instead of staying in front of him. That's not an accident. That's positioning. And then Stratton grabbed Mercer's wrist. It wasn't a full takedown. It wasn't a dramatic struggle. It was that specific moment where an officer transitions from conversation to control. The kind of grip that says restraints are next, even if the officer hasn't said the word arrest. That moment got captured 3 ways. It was on Stratton's body camera. It was on Harbor and Stone's security footage from multiple angles. And it was on at least one customer's phone because someone near the back had quietly started recording when Stratton ignored the counter and walked straight to Mercer. Tessa immediately pushed back again. She repeated that Mercer was not a problem in her cafe and that the staff did not request police help. She kept the focus on the facts that mattered. Mercer was a customer and there was no trespass, no disturbance, and no staff complaint. Stratton didn't let go right away. He kept pressure on Mercer's arm like he was testing how far he could go before Mercer flinched or reacted. That's another tactic. Provoke an instinctive movement, then call it resistance. Mercer didn't give him that. He stayed seated. He kept his hands visible. He did not pull away. He didn't create a clip where anyone could pretend it was 2 sides. Instead, he kept his voice even and continued the same questions about detention and lawful basis. He kept everything boring and record-friendly. That was intentional. A few minutes later, the situation changed. Not because Stratton calmed down, but because a supervisor arrived. Sergeant Dana Whitaker came in with the look of someone who wanted the issue gone before it turned into a mess. She listened for a minute, watched the body language, then focused on the fastest solution, one that would make the cafe quiet again. Sergeant Dana Whitaker walked in and read the room fast. She saw Stratton standing too close to a seated customer. She saw a manager hovering nearby with that controlled panic businesses get when police start creating a scene. She saw customers watching without saying anything, and she knew this was the kind of situation that looked worse the longer it lasted. Whitaker's first move was the standard supervisor move. End it with the least friction. She asked what the issue was, then pushed toward an easy outcome. Mercer either showed identification or left, so everyone could move on and no one had to write much. Stratton fed her the version that made him sound reasonable. He said there had been a suspicious person complaint. He said Mercer was refusing to cooperate. He used broad language like safety and officer discretion. He kept the framing simple. Officer asks, citizen refuses, officer escalates. Whitaker took that framing and tried to convert it into compliance. She presented it like a choice Mercer was making, like he was deciding to be difficult over something small. Mercer didn't take the bait. He kept it procedural. He asked if he was being detained. He asked what lawful basis existed for the ID demand. He stayed focused on one thing. A vague complaint wasn't a crime, and a demand wasn't automatically lawful just because it came from a uniform. Whitaker tried to steer around the legal question. She pushed practical consequences instead. She signaled that the fastest way to avoid problems was to just do what Stratton wanted. She treated the lawful basis question like an unnecessary complication. That's when Tessa Rowe tightened the situation in a way Whitaker couldn't ignore. Tessa stated clearly that the staff had not called the police. She said Mercer was a customer. She said he wasn't causing a disturbance. And she said he was welcome to stay. That last part mattered because it cut off a common escape route officers use to justify removals. Trespass. If the property owner says someone is not trespassed, the officer can't pretend they were asked to leave by the business. Whitaker tested that anyway. She asked Tessa if she wanted Mercer removed or banned. Tessa said no. She confirmed it again. Mercer was allowed to be there? Now Whitaker had a problem. She had a patrol officer escalating inside a business that wasn't requesting help, with witnesses, with cameras, and with a man who wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening, and wasn't moving. Stratton reacted to the shift by leaning harder on control language. He described Mercer's questions as refusal. He implied risk. He pushed the idea that he needed Mercer standing up, outside, away from the table. Mercer didn't move. He didn't get loud. He didn't argue emotion. He held the same line. He would follow lawful orders once the lawful basis was stated. Until then, he wasn't going to perform obedience just to make the officer comfortable. Whitaker changed tactics. Instead of arguing the law, she tried to make the moment about convenience and public peace. She presented Mercer staying seated as a disruption, even though the only real disruption was Stratton hovering over him and grabbing his wrist earlier. She treated compliance like a social duty. Mercer kept it narrow. Detained or not detained. Lawful basis or no lawful basis. Free to leave or not. That's when Whitaker started thinking like a supervisor protecting the department, not like a supervisor backing her officer. She looked at Stratton's body cam. She looked at the customers. She looked at the manager. She recognized that if Stratton forced this, the footage would not match the report Stratton would later write. And she knew her name would be on the scene as the supervisor who let it happen. So she made the call. Whitaker ordered Stratton to disengage. Stratton didn't like it. His posture showed it. He wanted to finish what he started. He wanted Mercer to give in so the stop could be justified through submission. But a supervisor's order is a supervisor's order, and Whitaker was clearly choosing containment. Stratton backed off from Mercer's space. He stopped trying to pull him outside. He stepped away enough for the cafe to breathe again. Mercer didn't celebrate it. He didn't gloat. He treated it like a documented event that was still live. He asked for names and badge numbers. He asked in a way that made it clear he expected accuracy. He confirmed the body camera was recording. He did it calmly, but he did it in front of witnesses so it couldn't be denied later. Then he made the most important move of the morning. He turned to Tessa and asked her, in front of both officers, to preserve the cafe's security footage from before Stratton entered until after he left. He specifically included the full window of time so no one could later claim the relevant portion was missing. And by saying it out loud in front of them, he made it obvious he understood how evidence disappears when nobody locks it down early. Tessa agreed immediately. She also mentioned the cameras again, making sure everyone understood there were multiple angles. Whitaker heard that and didn't argue. She just moved the situation toward the exit. She wanted Stratton gone before he said something worse or did something that couldn't be explained away. Stratton left with Whitaker. Mercer stayed seated for a moment after they walked out, not because he was shaken, but because he was mentally indexing what mattered: the timeline, the witnesses, the cameras, the body cam, the fact that staff never called, the fact there was no trespass, and the fact the supervisor had ordered disengagement. And while the cafe tried to return to normal, Mercer was already treating it like a case file. Mercer didn't treat what happened at Harbor and Stone like a bad morning. He treated it like a record that would get rewritten unless he locked it down first. He stayed in the cafe long enough to do two things while the details were still fresh. He wrote a clean timeline, and he made sure the evidence didn't disappear. He noted the basics in order: time he entered, what he ordered, where he sat, the moment Stratton walked in and skipped the counter, the first ID demand, the shifting reasons, the attempt to pull him outside, the wrist grab, the manager's statements about no police call and no trespass, the supervisor arrival and the disengage order. He wrote it like someone who understood that later, small details would become the whole fight. Then he worked with Tessa like they were handling a safety incident for a business, not a drama for social media. Tessa had access to the cafe's camera system. She didn't just promise she would save it. She exported video from multiple angles, including the entry area where Stratton walked past the register without talking to staff, and the wide view that showed how close Stratton stood to Mercer's table. She pulled a time window that started before the officer entered and ended after he left, exactly like Mercer requested in front of them. They didn't keep only one copy. They created duplicates, stored them in separate places, and documented who handled what. Mercer made sure Tessa wrote down the export time, the camera angles included, and the system clock time. Those little details matter later when someone tries to claim footage was incomplete or altered. Next came the move that killed the usual excuse. Mercer sent formal preservation requests immediately, not vague complaints. Preservation notices that created a duty to retain specific records. He requested the body camera footage from Stratton and Whitaker, including the full pre-event buffer and the time after the disengagement. He requested dispatch and CAD notes tied to the call. He requested radio traffic. He requested the incident report and any supplemental reports. He also requested report version history and audit logs showing who accessed or edited it. This is what most people don't do, and it's why so many cases die. Departments can say footage overwrote. They can say systems purge automatically. They can say they don't have it anymore. A preservation request removes the ability to pretend it was an accident. Mercer didn't go online to argue. He didn't tag anyone. He didn't leak clips. He kept it quiet on purpose. A customer's phone video still made its way around locally because that's reality. But Mercer didn't chase the internet. He chased documentation. Within days, the department opened an internal review. On paper, it looked routine. Stratton wrote a report that tried to make the stop sound normal. His language was the kind that gets used when there's no real basis. He described suspicious behavior without naming what it was. He wrote about safety concerns without identifying a threat. He described Mercer as uncooperative because Mercer asked procedural questions and didn't volunteer ID. That report might have worked if video didn't exist. But video did exist. 3 angles plus a timeline, plus the manager confirming there was no call from staff and no trespass. Reviewers pulled the footage and started matching it line by line against the report. The first contradiction was simple. Stratton's report suggested he was responding to a complaint. Dispatch records didn't support that the way he framed it. The CAD entry didn't match the story he implied. The second contradiction was obvious. The report tried to make Mercer sound confrontational. The body cam and cafe footage showed a man seated, calm, hands visible, repeating the same procedural questions. Then came the detail that turned this from a questionable stop into a serious problem. About a week after the incident, a revised version of Stratton's report appeared in the system. It wasn't just an added paragraph labeled supplemental. The wording shifted. The justification got cleaner. The vague parts became more legal sounding. It looked like someone tried to retrofit probable cause language after realizing there was video and witnesses. And because Mercer had requested report versions and audit logs early, there was no way to pretend it didn't happen. The access logs showed when the report was opened and changed. The timestamps didn't match the original narrative timeline. The edits appeared after the preservation requests, and after it was clear the cafe footage existed. That's the moment the department stopped treating it like a customer complaint and started treating it like an evidence integrity issue. Internal affairs widened the scope, not because they suddenly cared about Mercer personally, but because report manipulation can infect everything. If one officer changes one report, you have to ask what else is being changed. They began pulling Stratton's prior stops in the same downtown zone. They looked for patterns, vague, suspicious language, Idaho demands, without a stated legal basis, repeated references to non-compliance when the footage showed calm behavior, and the same copy-paste phrasing across multiple reports. The pattern showed up fast. So did something worse. In multiple incidents, footage was incomplete in ways that didn't track naturally. Missing beginnings, missing audio, gaps that always seemed to start right before a tense interaction and end after it. That triggers a different kind of review. It's no longer only about whether an officer acted biased. It becomes about whether records were intentionally altered, withheld, or falsified. At that point, the case moved beyond local handling. Federal civil rights investigators got involved. The review expanded from one cafe stop to the unit's overall behavior downtown. They looked at who was being stopped, how often, what language officers used to justify it, and whether reports matched recordings. They interviewed witnesses from earlier stops, people who had never filed complaints because they assumed nothing would happen. They pulled the department's body cam retention policies, upload times, and access logs. They compared those logs to the times officers wrote or edited reports. They checked whether supervisors were reviewing footage before approving reports or signing off based only on the officer's narrative. Stratton was placed on administrative leave first, then suspended, then removed from patrol duties, then terminated. The department tried to isolate him as one bad actor because that's how institutions protect themselves. But the data didn't support a clean isolation story. The review showed repeated tolerance for vague stops and sloppy justification, and it showed supervision that prioritized speed over legality until the evidence forced their hand. That led to unit restrictions and policy changes, but the bigger fallout was legal. Federal prosecutors charged Stratton based on what the evidence supported: deprivation of rights under color of law, and evidence-related crimes tied to falsification and obstruction. This wasn't about a rude officer. It was about an officer using authority without lawful basis, then trying to rewrite the record to cover it. When the case reached court, Mercer's identity became known through official filings and declarations, not in the cafe, not as a flex, in the formal record, where credibility and precision mattered. And the reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Some people tried to claim the outcome happened only because Mercer was a judge, but the footage didn't care who he was. The logs didn't care who he was. The report edits didn't care who he was. The truth was simple. The same conduct that had been done to others finally collided with airtight documentation. That's why investigators also reviewed past arrests and stops tied to Stratton and officers close to him. Several cases got reopened because Credibility was now damaged. A few prosecutions were dropped. Defense attorneys requested hearings. The city started paying for mistakes it had ignored. Stratton went to trial. The recordings were played. The report versions were shown. The audit logs were explained. Witnesses testified, including Tessa, who confirmed the staff never called, and Mercer was never trespassed. The jury didn't have to guess what happened. They saw it. Stratton was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The city settled civil claims and took public hits it couldn't spin away. Downtown business owners demanded changes because they didn't want police turning customer spaces into stop-and-frisk zones with lattes. The department implemented new rules that supervisors couldn't ignore. Bodycam footage had to be reviewed early in certain encounters, not only after complaints went public. Report editing was restricted and flagged automatically with mandatory explanations. Preservation triggers were updated so any formal notice locked records immediately. And stop documentation required clear, specific basis language, not vague suspicion words. Mercer didn't do a victory lap. He went back to being private. He kept the focus where he wanted it from the start: documentation, lawful standards, and accountability that didn't depend on someone getting loud or getting lucky. And here's the lesson that matters for everyone watching. In moments like this, the power game is usually designed to make you emotional, make you move, make you react, and then label your reaction as the reason for force. Mercer refused to provide that. He stayed calm, he stayed procedural. He made witnesses and cameras part of the record. And then he locked the evidence down before anyone could rewrite it. So let me ask you, if you were in that cafe, would you have recorded? Would you have spoken up like Tessa did? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped it didn't turn into your problem? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced a stop where the story on paper didn't match what really happened, share what you're comfortable sharing. And if you want more stories where dignity, documentation, and accountability win in the real world, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel.
License and registration, now.
I'll comply. What's the reason for the stop before I start reaching?
Stop stalling. Get your documents.
I'm not stalling. I'm asking for the lawful basis.
Step out of the vehicle.
A Ridgehaven patrol officer thought he could turn a clean, law-abiding drive into a justified stop, then force his way into control when the driver didn't play along. What he didn't know was that the calm man behind the wheel of that rental car wasn't a random resident and wasn't a tourist. He was a state public integrity investigator running a controlled integrity test with concealed audio and video capturing every command, every escalation, and every move toward force. And right then, on the shoulder of a 2-lane road, the officer made the kind of decision that ends careers and starts indictments. Before we get into how this unfolded, drop where you're watching from, city, state, or country, in the comments. And if you watch these stories because you care about accountability and people getting treated fairly, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now rewind, because this wasn't just a traffic stop. Investigator Darius Coleman worked for the State Attorney General's Public Integrity Unit. He wasn't a patrol cop, and he wasn't there to argue on the roadside. His job was to document misconduct cleanly, preserve evidence, and let the system do the rest. Ridgehaven had been on the task force's radar for years. Complaints about unlawful stops, unnecessary force, and the same pattern afterward. Reports that didn't match what people described, missing footage, and internal reviews that always cleared the same names. The Attorney General's office didn't send Coleman in to make speeches. They sent him in to run a controlled test, the way they'd done in other towns when community complaints kept piling up and internal discipline kept going nowhere. The idea was simple. Put an investigator into normal conditions, follow every law, record everything, and see whether officers created a reason to stop, search, or escalate. Coleman set it up like a lab experiment. He rented a common sedan that wouldn't stand out, something you'd see in any grocery store parking lot. He chose a route that didn't invite excuses, No late-night cruising, no high-crime area framing, no sudden lane changes, no music, no tint, no broken lights, no expired tags. He checked everything twice. He had concealed audio and video running with redundant storage, and he'd already logged the start time. He also had a check-in protocol with the task force, because if Ridgehaven had a reputation for one thing, it was controlling the narrative after the fact. Ridgehaven itself ran on familiarity. People knew which officers were strict and which ones were aggressive. They knew which streets got patrolled hard and which ones didn't. And they knew what it looked like when a stop wasn't about traffic at all. It was about dominance, pressure, and creating a reason after the decision had already been made. Coleman drove through town midday, steady speed, full stops, clean turns, no hesitation. He wasn't there to provoke. He was there to remove every excuse. He wanted the stop, if it came, to be obviously manufactured. It didn't take long. A Ridgehaven cruiser slid in behind him and stayed there. Not passing, not turning off, just pacing him. Coleman didn't react. He kept the same speed. He used his signals early. He stayed centered in the lane. The cruiser stayed. Then the lights came on. Coleman didn't slam the brakes or roll forward like he was looking for a hiding spot. He slowed, signaled, and pulled over to a wide shoulder with clear sightlines. Exactly the kind of place officers claim they want for safety. He put the car in park. He turned down the air. He placed both hands in a visible position and waited. Two officers approached, Grant Halverson and Tyler Baines. Halverson took the lead without hesitation. His posture communicated that this was his stop, his call, his scene. Baines hung back half a step, scanning the car and watching Coleman's hands like he'd been trained to do, but also watching Halverson like he was trying to mirror him. Coleman didn't reach around. He didn't start digging in the glove box. He didn't give them a furtive movement to write later. He stayed still and let them run their script. Halverson started with the kind of opening that usually sounds routine, but was designed to put the driver on the defensive. He pressed for quick answers, a fast story, something inconsistent. Coleman responded the way a careful professional would, calm, minimal, and focused on the one thing that mattered. What lawful basis justified the stop? Coleman asked for the reason he'd been pulled over. Halverson didn't provide one. Instead, he shifted into control tactics. He repeated demands for documents and started stacking instructions on top of each other, creating a situation where any pause could be framed as non-compliance. He also moved his body closer to the window, using his physical presence to shrink Coleman's space. Coleman didn't refuse to cooperate. He did the opposite. He signaled he would comply with lawful commands, and he kept his hands visible. But he stayed anchored to the legal point. He asked again for the basis of the stop before he started reaching for anything. That was the hinge moment. Some officers hear that as a normal request. Halverson heard it as a challenge. His tone changed, and so did the tempo. The stop stopped being about traffic and turned into a test of obedience. Halverson escalated to ordering Coleman out of the vehicle. Baines shifted position, widening his stance and moving toward a flanking angle, like they were preparing for a pullout. Coleman didn't panic. He didn't argue in circles. He stayed controlled and kept the same strategy. Comply where required, ask for the legal basis, keep everything documented, and don't give them a justification by getting loud or moving fast. Halverson responded by tightening the pressure. He acted like the request for lawful basis was itself the problem. He leaned in, watched Coleman's face, watched his hands, and started building the kind of officer safety story that often shows up in reports when there isn't a real traffic violation to point to. Baines didn't interrupt. He didn't slow it down. He didn't ask Halverson what the stop was for. He stayed in formation. Coleman asked whether he was being detained or whether he was free to leave. He kept his voice level and his body still, because he knew what comes next in towns like this. The paperwork later would say the driver was agitated, argumentative, and refusing commands. even if the footage showed the opposite. Halverson reached the end of his patience with the conversation. The moment Coleman didn't instantly snap into the kind of compliance Halverson demanded, Halverson made it personal. He stopped trying to justify the stop and focused on forcing the outcome. He positioned himself tighter to the door, his shoulders squared. His hand moved toward the frame like he was preparing to act, not talk. And that was the second before Ridgehaven crossed the line from an unlawful stop into something the state could prosecute. Halverson stopped pretending the stop was about traffic. He brought his hand up to the window frame and shifted his weight forward like he was about to force a result. Coleman stayed still, hands visible, and kept doing the only thing that mattered in that moment, staying calm, giving them nothing they could honestly call a threat, and making sure the recordings captured every step of the escalation. Halverson moved from commands to force without a real bridge. He gave an order for Coleman to get out, then treated any attempt to clarify the lawful basis as defiance. He didn't point to a violation. He didn't explain what crime he suspected. He went straight to "because I said so" energy, the kind that turns into paperwork later that says the driver was argumentative and refused lawful orders. Baines adjusted his position, closer now, angled toward the driver's door. He wasn't de-escalating. He was preparing to assist. Coleman didn't reach for anything. He didn't twist around. He didn't make sudden movements. He kept his hands where they could see them. He communicated calmly that he would comply with lawful commands and that he needed a clear instruction before he started reaching for documents. He asked again for the reason he'd been stopped. That was the moment Halverson decided he was done with conversation. He drew his arm back and drove his bare fist into the window. The sound was sharp and immediate. Safety glass fractured and collapsed inward. It wasn't a slow break or a tap meant to scare. It was a full strike meant to end the stalemate and shock Coleman into instant compliance. Halverson's hand came back with small cuts, nothing dramatic, but enough to matter. He didn't pause to check it. He used the broken window as the excuse to flood the scene with urgency. He reached in through the opening and grabbed for Coleman's arm. At the same time, Halverson started narrating his version of events out loud, the way officers do when they know cameras are on, and they want their words to shape the story before anyone reviews the footage. He framed Coleman as refusing to comply. He framed the break as necessary. He framed the pullout as officer safety. Baines stepped in. Together they opened the door and pulled Coleman out of the vehicle. Coleman didn't swing. He didn't try to run. He didn't fight them. His body language stayed controlled, and his focus stayed on not giving them an excuse to claim he charged or lunged. But Halverson didn't need a real excuse. He already decided what the report would say. They forced Coleman toward the front of the car and pushed him down onto the hood. Halverson pinned him and moved fast into restraint. Baines assisted, controlling Coleman's arms. One of them called for backup as if they were dealing with a dangerous suspect, instead of a driver who'd been asking for a lawful basis. Coleman kept his voice steady and his movements minimal. He stated that he was not resisting, that he was cooperating, and that he wanted the lawful reason for the stop. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't insult. He stayed professional. Halverson kept narrating, tightening the label. He repeated non-compliant in a way that didn't match what was happening. The physical control was already established. Coleman was already restrained. The label was for the report. Within minutes, additional units arrived. The arriving officers didn't ask what traffic violation started it. They didn't ask what crime was suspected. They took cues from Halverson's tone and posture. This is how bad culture spreads in real time. One officer signals, "This guy is a problem," and everyone else falls into formation. Coleman was placed in handcuffs and moved to a patrol car. They searched his person and the vehicle. They acted like they were looking for something that would justify what viewers would later see on video. If they found nothing, the fallback would be the usual: nervous behavior, inconsistent answers. officer safety concerns. Coleman remained quiet when it mattered and spoke only to protect the record. He didn't debate them. He didn't beg. He noted key facts. He'd been pulled over without a stated reason. He'd kept his hands visible. And the escalation started when he asked for the lawful basis. Halverson kept control of the scene and did what officers in cover-up-prone departments often do next. He rushed the reset. He directed Baines and the others, repositioned the narrative, and pushed the stop toward transport before anyone could slow it down. The goal was to get Coleman away from the roadside where outsiders could see and into a station where the department controlled every camera angle and every interaction. Coleman was taken to the Ridgehaven station. At intake, the tone shifted from aggressive to procedural, but the objective stayed the same: isolate him and buy time. Time to align statements. Time to write a report that framed force as necessary. Time to decide what bodycam footage would be available and what would be missing. Coleman was placed in a holding area and kept there without clear explanations. He wasn't treated like someone being legitimately processed for a crime with a clear charge. He was treated like a problem to contain until the department decided how to package the story. Halverson and Baines were already building the paperwork version. They leaned on the standard language: refusal, noncompliance, officer safety. They described the broken window as a response to the driver's actions, not their own choice. They framed a calm request for a lawful basis as a threat to their authority. Coleman stayed controlled because that was part of the test too. A controlled integrity operation only works if the investigator doesn't get baited into behavior that muddles the record. Coleman didn't give them that. He waited, tracked the timeline in his head, and understood the other side of the chessboard. The task force would notice the missed check-in, and that would trigger a response. And while Ridgehaven officers believed they just contained another driver they could label and forget, the state was already moving. Because what Halverson did on that shoulder wasn't just misconduct, it was evidence. Ridgehaven thought it had time. That was the mistake departments like this always made. They assumed the person in the holding area was just another driver they could stall, confuse, and paper over. They assumed they could write the report first and let the facts chase it later. But Coleman's operation wasn't built on hope. It was built on triggers. When his scheduled check-in didn't happen, the state task force treated it as a problem, not a delay. They didn't call the station to ask politely. They moved like investigators who already knew the pattern in Ridgehaven. Isolate first, rewrite second. Deputy Attorney General Elaine Mercer arrived with state investigators and a signed warrant. She didn't walk in like a visitor. She walked in like oversight. Within minutes, the station's tone changed. The front desk staff stopped acting casual. Supervisors started appearing. People who had been comfortable making Coleman wait suddenly needed to know who authorized what and what exactly was happening. Mercer made the purpose clear without drama. She identified Coleman as a public integrity investigator, operating under an official misconduct probe. She informed Ridgehaven leadership that the stop, the force, and the detention were now part of a documented investigation, not a local matter they could manage internally. She also made it clear that the state was there to seize evidence, not request it. The warrant wasn't narrow. It covered body camera footage, dash camera footage, dispatch recordings, CAD logs, use of force reports, arrest paperwork, supervisor notifications, and any internal communications related to the incident. It also covered any attempts to edit, delay, delete, or withhold recordings. That part mattered because Ridgehaven's history wasn't just about bad stops. It was about what happened afterward. State investigators immediately started preservation steps. They separated involved officers from each other to prevent coordination. They collected phones where legally permitted under the warrant. They pulled system access logs. They locked down the evidence room and the digital evidence portal. They pulled the roster to identify everyone who responded to the stop and everyone who touched the paperwork after. Coleman was brought out. Not with the same posture Ridgehaven used when it was pretending he was a criminal, but with the posture of people who realized the ground had shifted. He was uncuffed, evaluated for injuries, and formally debriefed by the state team. He didn't gloat. He didn't argue with local staff. He provided a factual timeline and confirmed that concealed audio and video had captured the stop and escalation. The recordings removed the department's ability to control the story. They showed that Coleman had driven normally. They showed there wasn't a clear traffic violation. They showed Halverson pressing for control instead of articulating a lawful basis. They showed the escalation and the window strike happening without a reasonable bridge to immediate force. They also showed the on-scene narration that tried to label calm behavior as non-compliance. The state team then compared that to what Ridgehaven had started writing. That comparison is where cases like this stop being messy and start being clean. When the video says one thing and the report says another, it becomes less about interpretation and more about falsification. Halverson and Baines were placed on immediate leave that night. Other responding officers were pulled in for statements. Supervisors were questioned about notification timelines, policy compliance, and prior complaints. The chief and town attorney were informed that this was no longer a public relations problem. It was a legal exposure problem. And the state didn't stop at this stop, because the controlled test was designed to answer a bigger question. Was this an isolated incident or a repeatable pattern? The recordings gave the task force probable cause to expand. They obtained additional warrants and subpoenas. They reviewed prior stops involving Halverson and a small circle of officers who appeared repeatedly in complaint files. They pulled use of force incidents and compared them to medical records, citizen videos, and internal investigations. They audited missing camera footage and checked whether gaps clustered around specific officers and supervisors. They reviewed disciplinary files to see how often serious complaints ended with no finding, no action, or a quiet resignation. They found what the community had been saying for years: unlawful stops framed as minor violations, searches justified by vague wording, force justified by scripted labels, reports that read the same across incidents even when circumstances differed, internal reviews that cleared officers quickly, often relying on officer statements when video was missing. Once the state built the pattern, the consequences started stacking. Halverson was fired and referred for criminal prosecution. The charges weren't about hurt feelings or technicalities. They centered on civil rights violations under state law, unlawful use of force, and false reporting tied to the stop and detention. Depending on what the evidence showed about evidence handling and report coordination, additional charges followed for tampering or obstruction. Baines was treated differently, but not excused. The investigation focused on what he did, what he witnessed, and what he wrote. If he participated in the false narrative, he faced decertification and criminal exposure. If he cooperated early and truthfully, it reduced some consequences, but didn't erase accountability for actions taken on the roadside. Supervisors weren't safe either. If a sergeant signed off on a report that didn't match the facts, or if leadership ignored obvious red flags, the state treated that as part of the system, not an accident. Internal affairs staff were audited. Prior complaint handling became part of the case file. Ridgehaven's old habit of keeping everything inside the building stopped working once the state started pulling records directly. Then the civil lawsuit hit. Coleman sued the town and involved officers for unlawful stop, excessive force, false arrest or unlawful detention, and civil rights violations. Because he was a state investigator acting in an official capacity, the case didn't stay small. It became a public test of Ridgehaven's policing culture, training, supervision, and discipline failures. Discovery was brutal. The town had to hand over complaint histories, training records, policy documents, staffing patterns, camera maintenance logs, internal communications, and prior settlement information. It wasn't just about Halverson anymore. It was about whether Ridgehaven built a system that produced Halverson and protected him. The settlement was large enough that the town couldn't pretend it was a one-off. Taxpayers felt it. Budget meetings got ugly. Residents demanded names and timelines. People who had been dismissed for years finally had a case number they could point to and say the state agreed something was wrong. Policy changes followed because they had to. The town implemented outside oversight for stops and use of force reviews. Camera policy was tightened with automatic upload requirements and stronger discipline for missing footage. Supervisors were required to document lawful bases for stops in a way that could be audited. The state mandated training and periodic compliance checks. Some officers resigned before they could be terminated. Others were decertified. Recruitment changed because Ridgehaven's reputation changed. Coleman didn't become a hero in the way small towns try to frame these things. He became proof. Proof that staying calm matters. Proof that documentation matters. Proof that systems that rely on intimidation collapse when someone shows up prepared to preserve the truth. And Ridgehaven learned the lesson it had avoided for years. When misconduct becomes routine, eventually someone tests it. And if you fail that test on camera, the consequences don't stay on the roadside. Now here's the question for you. If you were in Coleman's seat, would you have stayed that calm, or would the pressure have pulled you into an argument they could twist later? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more realistic stories about accountability and justice, like the video and subscribe to the channel.
You, let me see your ID.
What's the lawful reason you need my ID?
Don't argue. ID, now.
I'm not refusing. I'm asking for the legal basis before I comply.
Stand up. You're being detained if you don't comply.
I'm complying. State what crime you believe I committed.
The officer stood too close to the counter, voice up, shoulders squared, and he kept pointing at Jordan Wallace like Jordan had done something that needed immediate control. Ethan Klein told everyone in that cafe that Jordan had to show ID right now and step away from the register. Jordan didn't raise his voice. He stayed planted, hands visible, and asked what the lawful reason was. Klein didn't answer that. He repeated the demand, then warned that if Jordan didn't comply immediately, he was going to be detained. That was the moment the room shifted. People stopped talking. The barista froze with a cup in hand, and a couple of phones came up quietly, like people already knew this was about to get ugly. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Country, state, city, wherever. And if you watch stories where the truth is in the footage and accountability actually lands, hit like and subscribe because this one only makes sense once you see how the report and the body cam didn't match. Now, rewind because this didn't start with shouting. It started like a normal weekday lunch rush. The cafe sat on a corner near a courthouse and a few government buildings. It was the kind of place where suits grabbed espresso, students typed on laptops, and regulars knew the staff by name. People rotated in and out fast. Nobody expected drama. And most people, when a uniform walked in, automatically made space and kept their eyes down. Jordan Wallace didn't come in looking for attention. He was a black man in his early 40s, fit, calm, and tired in the way you get when you've been traveling and working long hours. He was in town on duty-related travel. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't trying to broadcast what he did for a living. He ordered a coffee, waited his turn, and kept it simple. What most people in that cafe didn't know was that Jordan was an active senior deputy U.S. Marshal. He understood law enforcement policies, constitutional limits, and exactly how fast a small misunderstanding could turn into something bigger when ego got involved. Ethan Klein walked in already scanning. He was a patrol officer, late 20s to early 30s, with that rigid posture some officers use when they want the room to adjust around them. His body cam was on. It captured everything from the moment he entered, including his tone and what he chose not to explain. Klein focused on Jordan almost immediately. Not the loud group, not the guy cutting the line. Jordan standing quietly at the counter. Klein moved in and started questioning him right there, loud enough for people nearby to hear. He demanded identification and asked what Jordan was doing there. Jordan didn't argue about the request itself. He asked the important question first. What was the reason for the stop? What was the suspicion? What was the legal basis? That question mattered. Because without a clear lawful basis, it wasn't a lawful detention. It was just a demand, backed by a badge in a public place. Klein didn't respond with a reason. He responded with pressure. He told Jordan to stop being difficult. He told him to step back. He told him to produce ID immediately. Jordan kept his voice even. He didn't insult Klein. He didn't threaten anything. He did what trained professionals do when a situation starts sliding. He slowed it down. He made his hands visible. He suggested an off-ramp. He indicated that he could identify himself properly if Klein called a supervisor or handled it the right way, away from the crowd. Klein didn't take the off-ramp. He took it as a challenge. This is where the power chess started. Klein didn't have a clear reason to detain Jordan, so he tried to build one in real time. He treated Jordan's calm insistence on a lawful basis as refusal. Then he treated refusal as non-compliance. Then he started framing the situation like Jordan was causing a scene, even though the only raised voice in the early moments was Klein's. The barista tried to keep the line moving. The cafe manager stepped closer, not to interfere, but to protect the business and calm the room. The manager asked what was going on and whether they needed to move the conversation outside. Klein shut that down fast and told the manager to stay out of it. Jordan stayed focused. He kept repeating the same 2 points. He wasn't doing anything illegal, and if the officer was making a demand, the officer needed to explain the lawful reason for it. That's not disrespect. That's the standard. But in situations like this, some officers treat knowing your rights like an act of defiance. Klein escalated again. He told Jordan he was being detained now. Still no clear articulation of a crime, no clear explanation of suspicion. Just a shift into control mode. Jordan asked whether he was free to leave. Klein didn't answer directly. He told Jordan to turn around. Jordan didn't swing, didn't yell, didn't flinch. He stayed calm and moved carefully, like someone trying not to give the officer any excuse to claim a threat. But Klein had already decided what story he wanted the footage to support. Klein reached for Jordan's arm. Jordan instinctively tensed, not to fight, but to keep his balance and maintain control of his body in a crowded space. Klein immediately labeled that as resistance. He said it out loud, so the body cam would capture the phrase. That tactic shows up a lot. If an officer can't clearly justify the stop, the next move is often to turn the person's hesitation, confusion, or basic physical reaction into resisting, so the focus shifts from the officer's basis to the person's behavior. Now everyone was watching. A patron near the window started recording openly. Another person whispered that Jordan hadn't done anything. Someone else told the person recording to keep filming. The staff looked scared because they've seen how quickly the wrong moment can turn into a lawsuit, a viral clip, or both. Klein ordered Jordan's hands behind his back. Jordan complied in the most controlled way possible, still insisting he wasn't resisting and still asking what he was being arrested for. Klein didn't provide a clean answer. He kept repeating compliance commands and talking over Jordan's questions. Then the cuffs went on. The sound of the ratchet in a quiet cafe is sharp. It turns an argument into a public event. The whole place went silent except for Klein giving commands and the body cam capturing every word. Jordan tried one more off-ramp. He indicated he was law enforcement, that this could be verified quickly, and that Klein needed to slow down and call a supervisor. Klein dismissed it immediately. He treated it like a lie told by someone trying to dodge consequences. He said that part out loud, too, like he wanted the camera to hear his certainty. And that was the real problem. Certainty without basis. Control without explanation. Klein marched Jordan toward the door, past staring customers, past the counter staff, past the manager who looked like they wanted to intervene but didn't want to get arrested next. Jordan stayed upright, calm, and deliberate. No yelling, no theatrics, just controlled breathing and a steady focus on procedure. Outside, Klein positioned Jordan near the patrol car. The body cam angle caught Jordan turning his head slightly to keep the officer in view, to keep the situation documented, and to keep his own tone consistent. Jordan again pushed for verification. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He made it clear there was a simple way to resolve this. Klein didn't take it. Instead, he started narrating his justification in fragments. Words like disorderly, obstruction, failure to comply, without connecting them to a specific action that actually fit those terms. That's the tell. When the language gets broad and generic, it usually means the foundation is weak. And right as Klein moved to place Jordan into the back of the unit, another vehicle pulled up hard. A supervisor arrived. Sergeant Maria Chen stepped out, looked from Klein to Jordan, and immediately read the scene the way experienced supervisors do. Crowded location, public arrest, witnesses recording, and an officer who looked amped up instead of controlled. She approached with the first question that decides everything in moments like this. She asked Klein, in plain terms, what his lawful basis was. And Klein didn't have a clean answer ready when it mattered most. Sergeant Maria Chen didn't walk into the scene loud. She walked into it like she already understood the risks. A public arrest, multiple witnesses filming, and an officer whose energy didn't match what the situation looked like. She took control immediately. She directed Klein to step back and explain, clearly and in order, what crime he believed Jordan had committed and what specific actions supported detention and arrest. Klein gave a scattered answer. He leaned on broad labels and tried to backfill justification after the fact. Chen didn't accept labels. She pushed for facts. Then she shifted to Jordan. Jordan stayed calm and did the same thing he'd been doing the whole time. He kept his hands visible, kept his tone controlled, and kept steering the situation toward verification instead of confrontation. He didn't posture. He didn't argue to win. He focused on ending the wrongful arrests safely. Chen asked Jordan for identification and credentials, but she did it the right way, with distance, with care, and without treating a request like a command backed by threats. Jordan told her he had federal law enforcement credentials on him, and that verification could be done quickly through proper channels. Chen didn't ask Klein to handle it. That mattered. When a supervisor takes over, it's not just about rank. It's about removing the ego factor and recentering policy. Jordan produced his credential wallet. Chen visually checked the photo, the name, the agency designation, and the expiration details. She didn't snatch it. She didn't turn it into a tug-of-war. She treated it like evidence that needed to be verified, not challenged. Klein tried to dismiss it again, and he did it with the same tone he'd used inside the cafe, as if the problem was Jordan's attitude rather than the lack of lawful basis. Chen didn't let him keep driving the narrative. She moved a few steps away and called it in. She contacted dispatch and requested verification through appropriate channels. She also called the watch commander to document that she had a potentially wrongful arrest unfolding in public, and that she was pausing the situation pending confirmation. While that happened, Chen managed the scene like a supervisor who'd done it before. She assigned another responding unit to stand by, not as muscle, but as a buffer. She made sure the crowd didn't close in. She told the cafe staff they could return to work, and that she would get their statements later. She also noted the people recording, because she knew those videos would exist no matter what the department wanted later. Jordan stayed cuffed during the first few minutes of verification, because once cuffs are on, officers tend to default into caution. Chen didn't pretend that was ideal. She treated it as temporary and time-limited. She kept the verification moving. Dispatch came back with partial information first. Jordan's name didn't light up the way local police names do because federal databases and local systems don't always play nice. That's where a lot of officers stop and decide they were right all along. Chen didn't. She escalated the verification to the right source instead of using the system limitation as an excuse. Jordan provided a direct agency contact pathway. Chen placed the call. A duty officer confirmed who Jordan was and confirmed his status. That should have ended everything, and it did, but not smoothly. Chen walked back, now holding the confirmed verification in her hand, like a switch that changed the entire legal situation. She directed Klein to remove the cuffs immediately. Klein hesitated for a second, like he was deciding whether to comply or argue. Chen didn't give him space for debate. She made it clear this was no longer optional. Klein removed the cuffs. Jordan rolled his wrists once, not dramatically, just checking the stiffness. He didn't take victory laps. He didn't taunt. He didn't raise his voice. He stayed professional because he knew exactly what happens when a wrongfully arrested person starts celebrating in the moment. It gives the other side something to clip, something to label, something to twist. Chen addressed the crowd next briefly and without theatrics. She didn't apologize on behalf of the city out loud, because supervisors rarely do that in public while everything is still unfolding. But she made it clear Jordan was being released and that the situation was being handled. Then she did something else important. She separated Klein from Jordan. She didn't let Klein continue hovering, explaining, or attempting to salvage the story through more contact. She sent him to his vehicle and told him to start documenting his actions while the details were fresh. That was a quiet move, but it was a strong one. It meant Chen expected his reasoning to be scrutinized. Jordan asked for the incident number and the supervisor's information. He also asked for the process to file a complaint and to preserve body cam footage. He didn't threaten lawsuits in the street. He didn't turn it into a speech. He handled it like a man who had done this kind of documentation for other people before. Chen gave him the information he requested. She also took down Jordan's contact details and professional info because she knew this wasn't ending on the sidewalk. Before Jordan left, Chen asked him to give a brief account while it was still fresh, where he was standing, what Klein said, what Jordan said, and what actions occurred before the cuffs. Jordan summarized it cleanly, focusing on facts, not feelings. He emphasized one point again. Klein had never clearly stated a lawful basis before escalating to detention and arrest. Chen then spoke with the cafe manager and a couple of staff members. They told her what they saw. Jordan waiting calmly, Jordan asking questions, and Klein escalating. She also noted multiple witnesses had recordings from inside the cafe and outside near the patrol car. Jordan walked back into the cafe for a moment, not to make a scene, but to close the loop with the people who had just watched him get cuffed in line like he was dangerous. The manager offered him water. A couple of patrons gave that quiet, uncomfortable solidarity people give when they're not sure what to say. Jordan didn't turn it into a moment. He nodded, thanked the staff, and left. That night, Jordan did what most people don't have the knowledge or patience to do. He filed a formal complaint in a way that made it hard to bury. He documented the time, location, officer name, supervisor name, and the sequence of events. He included the request for body cam preservation. He listed the cafe staff as witnesses and noted that bystander footage existed. He also notified his own chain of command, because federal agencies don't ignore incidents like this when one of their own was publicly arrested without a clear basis. Within the department, the first version of the story started forming fast, because that's what happens after a public incident. The paperwork tries to become the official reality. Klein wrote his report, and the problem for Klein was simple. The body cam existed, and it captured the parts that reports usually try to smooth over: the missing lawful basis, the escalation pattern, the moment he labeled resistance to justify force, and the fact that Jordan stayed controlled while the officer drove the tension. By the time Internal Affairs got the complaint, it wasn't just one person's word against another. It was footage, witness statements, and a supervisor who had shown up and taken the cuffs off after verification. And once that kind of file lands on the right desk, the next phase is never about feelings. It's about violations. Internal Affairs opened the case fast, not because departments love bad headlines, but because this one had two things they couldn't outrun: a supervisor on scene who had reversed the arrest, and body cam footage from the first second Klein walked into the cafe. Jordan's complaint wasn't vague, it was structured. It listed the timeline, named witnesses, demanded preservation of video, and highlighted the core issue: detention and arrest without a clearly stated lawful basis, followed by escalation when Jordan didn't submit to an unexplained demand. That forced the investigation into a simple question chain. What specific crime supported arrest? What level of force was used? And was it justified? Did the report match the footage? Klein's report tried to frame the situation as a necessary control of a disruptive person. He leaned on broad terms like non-compliance and obstruction. He described Jordan as aggressive and implied the cafe scene had been tense because of Jordan's behavior. The body cam showed something else. It showed Klein initiating the confrontation, keeping his voice up, and demanding ID without articulating a clear reason. It showed Jordan staying controlled, asking for the basis, and offering verification in a safer way. It showed the escalation pattern: demand, pressure, detention language, physical grab, then immediate labeling of resistance to justify cuffs. It also showed how quickly the story shifted once the supervisor arrived and focused on procedure. Internal Affairs didn't rely on one clip. They pulled the full body cam file, dispatch logs, radio traffic, and statements from the cafe manager, baristas, and multiple customers. They also collected at least one bystander recording that captured the arrest from a different angle, including how calm Jordan remained while being cuffed. Then they compared everything to policy. This is the part people miss. Investigations like this aren't mainly about whether the officer looked rude. They're about whether the officer met the legal and policy thresholds for what they did. The sustained findings stacked up: unlawful detention and arrest based on failure to articulate reasonable suspicion and probable cause; escalation inconsistent with de-escalation policy, especially in a crowded public space; improper use of authority, including turning a rights-based question into a compliance test; failure to follow supervision expectations, since the incident was already high risk before it became an arrest; inaccurate or misleading reporting, because the written narrative didn't match what the camera captured. There was also a credibility issue. Once the footage contradicted the report on key points, everything Klein claimed became suspect, including his stated reasons for initiating the contact. Klein tried to defend himself, the way officers often do in these cases, saying he felt threatened, saying he had to control the scene, saying Jordan's tone signaled risk, saying the crowd made it dangerous. None of that solved the missing foundation. If the lawful basis isn't there at the start, the rest becomes damage control. The department's command staff reviewed the IA file with legal. They saw the same problem IA saw. If this went to court, the footage would be played for a jury, and the city would be explaining why an arrest happened in a cafe without a clear reason being stated before cuffs went on. Klein was terminated, not transferred, not resigned, fired. The department cited the sustained violations and the report footage conflict as the line they couldn't cross. That termination didn't fix what happened to Jordan, but it did send a signal to every officer watching. Cameras don't just record suspects, they record decisions. Jordan didn't stop at the internal process. He filed a formal claim against the city. His case wasn't built on emotion. It was built on documentation, unlawful arrest, public humiliation, restraint without cause, and the risk created by an officer escalating in a packed cafe. The city settled. Settlements don't always mean someone admits wrongdoing on paper, but they do mean the city's lawyers saw the exposure and chose a controlled outcome over a public trial. The settlement included money, but the non-money terms mattered more. The city agreed to policy and training changes tied to the exact failure points. Clearer requirements that officers articulate the lawful basis for stops and detentions early, and that they document it consistently. A supervision trigger for public discretionary arrests in low-level situations, requiring a supervisor check-in when feasible before escalation, not after. A stricter standard for labeling resistance, including guidance that minor body movement, confusion, or reflexive tension could not be used as a shortcut justification without clear supporting facts. Bodycam audit changes, including random audits and targeted audits, when complaints alleged unlawful stops or report inconsistencies. A review process that compared arrest reports to bodycam footage in certain categories of cases, instead of assuming the report was the truth by default. Refresher training on detentions, arrests, and constitutional standards, with scenario-based work that forced officers to practice articulating the basis cleanly under stress. Those changes didn't erase the incident, but they changed what the department could ignore going forward. For Jordan, the outcome was complicated. He didn't want to be the example. He wanted coffee and a quiet lunch. But he also understood the larger point. Most people don't have federal credentials, the confidence to stay controlled, or the knowledge to demand proper verification without escalating the risk. Jordan kept working. He didn't do interviews chasing attention. He kept his focus on the job and on making sure the paperwork trail stayed intact, so the system couldn't quietly rewrite the event later. Sergeant Chen's role stayed important too. Her actions didn't just correct the moment. They created the record that made accountability possible. She arrived, asked for the lawful basis, verified credentials the right way, and separated ego from procedure. That kept the situation from getting worse, and kept the department from pretending it never happened. And Klein's firing became a cautionary lesson inside that agency. If an officer couldn't explain the reason for a stop, the stop shouldn't happen. If they couldn't explain the reason for an arrest, the cuffs shouldn't go on. If their report didn't match the footage, their career could end. Now here's the question for you watching. If you were in that cafe, what would you have done? Would you have recorded? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have kept your head down because it felt safer? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever seen a situation where the truth was in the footage and accountability actually landed, share what happened. Or what? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because these stories keep coming, and the next one is just as real.